everybody, it's Brian David Johnson, and I am the guest editor of the IEEE Computer Magazine special issue on the world of making. And in this, we took kind of a different approach to kind of pulling together this special issue. We went all over the world and got different people to give us their perspective on making. We talked to people who are doing work in biology, design, science, business, technology, entertainment, education, and culture. And we wanted to start off the whole issue a little differently. And that's why we started off the issue on making in the IEEE Computer Magazine. The whole thing starts off with a poem, an actual poem about making. And we're really lucky today to have the author of that poem, Matt Giordano, on the podcast. So, Matt, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Great to be here.
So, Matt, first off, I just have to thank you. I have to thank you for signing up and giving us the poem. I should tell the listeners that Matt also works at the Intel Corporation where I'm a futurist. And Matt and I have worked together for many years, and I have been a fan of Matt's poetry for many years as well. And for those who haven't heard Matt's poem, To Make is to Think, there's going to be a link that you can actually go and hear his reading of it right next to the podcast. But Matt, first off, thank you so much for doing this. Let's tell a little people about yourself. I mean, you work in the high-tech industry, but you're also a poet. So what's your background, and also what's your really kind of path to making?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a kind of the path is a twisty and windy one. Currently, I work with you at Intel. I run our Future Experiences design team, where I have a great group of folks who are interaction designers and design strategists and people who are really excited about pushing on the bounds of technology, creating experience prototypes around new ways that people could interact with or relate to or think about technology. And I've been doing that kind of work, I would say, in one way, shape, or form or another for the last 15 or so years. And I've also, overlapping with that, I've been writing poems probably closer to 30 years. So it's been a long time since the two of those activities have kind of, they kind of meld together at times, and they inform each other on and off in the context of prototyping and designing, and also the writing of poetry.
And let's talk about the poem that you gave us, to Make is to Think. What was your process? I mean, I have to say, it starts off with one of my favorite lines. As I said, I'm a fan of Matt's poetry, but the first line, to reinvent the shape of these soap bubbles with a transistor radio, is probably one of the best opening lines of a poem I've heard in a very long time. So, Matt, what was, as you sort of, as I came to you and said, hey, I often ask you to do crazy things, but I kind of come to you and said, hey, can you do me a poem about making for this IEEE Computer Magazine special edition on making? What was that process like? What were you thinking about, and what were you hoping to really accomplish in the poem?
Well, it is like many times you ask me to do crazy things, Brian, and the first thing out of my mouth is, sure, let's do it. So at first I really wasn't thinking much about it. But then taking it seriously and stepping back and saying, wow, no, there could be something really cool here to think about this space that is so vibrant and has so many people doing so many wonderful, crazy things in it. What might a poem about this be? And, I started out drafting as I want to do. There's a lot of things, and I think this is just making in general, right? There's a lot of false starts. There's a lot of crazy stuff, and I ended up throwing a bunch of stuff away. But what really came out for me was not that the poem. What ended up being the intent for me was to try to capture that feeling of discovery and the energy of discovery, right? So it's that moment well before we know whether something works or doesn't work, right?
Mm-hmm.
that moment where the first idea kind of enters the brain and you think like, oh, hey, this could work, or maybe there's something here. So I really wanted to kind of get after that, hopefully in the tone and the imagery, to kind of talk about the starting of all of that. It's a very tactile, very tangible poem in many ways. At least I think so. But the move behind that has been always that kind of energy. And you know, I wanted to really be able to make Rube Goldberg's name a verb. And so that it seemed like a perfect opportunity to do that, right? So that, you know, it would be nice if that stuck, that people started using that, like, look, there's that thing, Rube Goldberging its way across the room. So, you know, something like that. But, you know, so it was that energy. It was that sense of discovery I really wanted to kind of explore. And what I had seen in a lot of maker fairs and talking to people who have been engaged with that. And I guess you know, the idea of poetry really, it is a kind of making. It's a kind of sense making. It's a kind of building. And, you know, I was thinking about this the other day. Metaphor becomes one of those wonderful tools that I think is certainly important in poetry. You know, this idea of placing two seemingly unrelated things next to each other. And then you really see how they mirror each other in these kind of unexpected ways. I think that's really, this idea of metaphor is something that's happening all the time at maker fairs, right? People of all ages they're cobbling things, they're hacking things together in the most unexpected ways. And those are really real-world, tangible metaphors that is everywhere for us to look at. And there's a beautiful thing to that.
And I think having what you were able to accomplish with the poem, and even I think the inclusion of the poem in the edition, shows that intersection. Just as you say, putting two things that you wouldn't normally expect to be next to each other and seeing what happens is, you know, kind of at the DNA of making, much like putting a poem in the IEEE Computer Magazine about making, right, to get people to think a little bit differently, to spark that creativity. And I think what you've been able to do, even in the subject of the poem, but also in the construction of the poem, is bring together a lot of those disparate ideas, those disparate approaches, and really come up with something that captures it in a way, not only with your words, but with the actual fact of it being there. And also, kudos for, you know, using Rube Goldberging its way across the room is a pretty awesome thing to have. But what do you think, now that you've done this, and I mean, like you said at the beginning, oftentimes your poetry and, you know, your professional work intersect and then diverge and then intersect and then diverge. What do you think that people could take away with, or what do you hope they would take away in the future when it comes to making and technology and poetry and the intersection between all of them?
That's a great question. You know, I think at one level, reading a poem or reading a story or seeing a compelling artifact that somebody's made at a fair or a prototype is about inspiration. You know, so I hope in some ways that you know, that in a small way the poem can maybe get somebody to think about something that they'd been thinking about, and that it resonates in some way, right? That there's a connection with people that says, yeah, I do that too, or I feel that. I think there's also, you know, perhaps a little larger message that you alluded to in starting the IEEE with a poem, is this, back to the idea of that metaphor, placing those things that don't seem like they're related or have something in common. And what I've found in talking with a lot of people, I mean, I like you do, I come across conversations, or I have conversations with engineers all the time, and it's remarkable the number of times you'll hear something like, oh yeah, well, I'm an engineer by training, right? But I also am a musician. or I'm an actor, or I'm an amazing fly fisherman, right? This idea that we all have these different interests and passions and energies that all start combining together to make who we are and help produce the things that we do in the world is fantastic. And I think the approach to this magazine and the way it's been kind of curated is fantastic, and hopefully it works on that inspiration and the connection with what are seemingly disparate things aren't disparate at all.
Well, and you start us off, I think, on a great note. So, Matt, where can people go to find more about your poetry?
Right now, I've got a one collection out with the University of Tampa Press. It's called Public Gestures. So I have one collection out. The next manuscript is in the works. It's nearly finished and is kind of hunting around for a publisher. But there's that, and there are a few poems on the web scattered about. But I'm working on a site as well.
Okay, that would be great. Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. And for all those listening, if you want to hear Matt's reading of his poem, which is called "To Make Is to Think," you'll see a link up there on the site as well. Matt did a reading for us. But Matt Giordano, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for taking that leap with me and starting this whole thing off with a poem, which is really, really just fantastic. And thank you. Just thanks. I really appreciate it.
Great, Brian. Thank you. This has been fantastic.